Hi everyone, welcome to another episode of VO's webinar series. My name's Ollie, I'm the UK Market Manager here for VO. Really delighted today to be joined by a very special guest who has worked for the FAW, coached Loughborough University's first team, coached at Swansea City, Shrewsbury Town, and is now the under-23s coach at Chelsea. Also one of the youngest ever coaches to hold a pro license in the UK, if not the youngest. Welcome, Eric Ramsay.
Hi, Ollie, how are you?
Good, very well, thank you. Really happy that you're here, and yeah, thanks so much for joining us on. So the aim of today's session really is going to be obviously a conversation with Eric to shed some light on your coaching journey, why, when, how you became a professional coach, the tools then required to follow a similar career trajectory that you're obviously still on. Hopefully by doing this, we'll dispel some of the mythology around sort of that age-old phrase, it's who you know in coaching. We'll also try and explore how far technology has come over your last sort of 5 or 6 years in coaching, as someone who I'm sure you'll agree has embraced new methods of data and video analysis. So it's going to be insightful, interesting. Hopefully, Eric, you can also offer some of our coaching community some nice tips and tricks. I mean, first question really is when did you decide and realize that you wanted to be a coach way back when?
I suppose, like most young lads, my dream was always to be a player. But I think I was aware fairly early on that I was never going to reach the heights that I would have wanted to. I dreamt of being a professional. I think it probably became pretty clear that wasn't going to be the case from the age of sort of 13 or 14. But that was the point at which I'd already started doing some local grassroots work, helping out with some of the youngsters in my small town in Wales. And I felt pretty quickly that I had perhaps had an aptitude for coaching. And it was probably that early that my attention turned mostly towards coaching as opposed to playing. I continued to play right up until my second year of university. I continued to play at a relatively high level, but coaching always ran alongside that. And it was always my intention to become a professional coach as soon as possible. So it was something that I identified as a strength in myself fairly early, I would say.
That's interesting. What do you think, I suppose, was the turning point when you realized, look, maybe I'm not as good as the others out there on the pitch, or as good as the others in comparison to perhaps making it? Did you have that sort of epiphany moment, or was it kind of quite gradual?
Yeah, I don't think it was. There was no one moment where I thought, oh no, this is not going to happen for me. But I think as the years go by, I was involved with professional academies when I was younger. I played in the Welsh Premier League prior to going to university. But I think once you get to the point of 15, 16 and you're not knocking on the door at one of the to be a scholar at one of the top clubs, then your chances of making it are few and far between. I was desperate to stay in the game, besotted by football, really fascinated with how it's played, how it's taught, how it engages people. So I wanted to make a career in football, in spite of the fact that wasn't going to be as a player. So that was when I suppose that I tried to think pretty purposefully about the route to make that happen, and that led me to university and beyond. Yeah.
I mean, you said, university. See in the presentation, Loughborough, was that, did you consciously pick Loughborough to be sort of actually, this is where the best coaches potentially go, this is where the best sports professionals go? Was that a main reason for that?
Yeah, I mean, in actual fact, I did have the opportunity to stay on as a full-time player at my local club, TNS, who play in the Welsh Premier League. And I'd said to myself that if I did get a place at Loughborough, then That was a university that I'd go to. I hadn't applied anywhere else, so I was hanging my hat on going there. Obviously Loughborough's world renowned for not only being a top place to go and be a sports person, home to loads and loads of elite athletes across lots of Olympic sports, a high caliber of footballer, many of whom have gone on to have professional careers. So I thought it was certainly the best place to go and continue to play, but also from an academic standpoint, again, world-renowned institution for research within sport, seen as arguably the best place in the world to go and study sports science. So I thought it would give me the best blend of continuing to train at a high level, or a relatively high level as a player, but also start trying to give myself some tools that would stand me in good stead as a coach. And in actual fact, it transpired that it was the first place that I actually started coaching. I didn't think that would be the case. They're all coaching at a relatively high level, I would say. I hadn't anticipated having that opportunity so early at Loughborough, and that actually saw the end to me playing at all. So I was really fortunate that I ended up playing at a good level, having the opportunity to study from an academic perspective at a really high level, and then also take my first steps on the serious coaching ladder.
So I've lost you. I've lost someone there.
Have you got me?
Yeah, I've got you back. That's good.
Great.
Yeah. So you said that that was when, Loughborough was somewhere where you obviously initially started coaching. I suppose. Did you think that that realization and that sort of tipping point in the fact that you wanted to be a coach rather than a player, or sort of that was your desire, that sort of removed the element of heartbreak that obviously a lot of players suffer from when they don't make it, or when they know they're not going to make it, if they get injuries or whatever? They don't necessarily see coaching as a pathway. They just see, I'm not going to be a footballer, I'm going to have to go to school, or that kind of mindset. That really wasn't the case for you, I guess, because you already had it in your mind that Loughborough is the place for me, and I do want to start coaching and develop my career in that respect away from professional football.
Yeah, I think I was fortunate in one sense, in that I was never really close to being a top level player. I know there's lots of current top coaches who have had chronic injuries that lead to them dropping out of the game. I think mine was probably a more a chronic lack of ability. So I don't think, it wasn't a hard landing when I realised that I wasn't going to be a player. But obviously the fact that I had a real focus toward hopefully becoming a professional coach at some point, that was a way of channeling my energy, I suppose, from a sporting and football perspective. I think I was fortunate at Loughborough in the sense that at the time there were some real role models that had been through the Loughborough football program and ended up working in professional football. Some trailblazers in sports science. Kieran Mckenna, the current Man United assistant manager, he was older than me at university, but he was working as the first team coach alongside a Scotsman called Stuart McLaren in the year above me, sort of thing. So there was a real coaching school, I would say, at Loughborough at that point, and I ended up in the role that Kieran was in. And then as I left, a guy called Matt Prestridge, he followed me in that role. Matt Prestridge is now working as a first-team coach in the Premier League with Sheffield United. So I think there was a real buzz for coaching at Loughborough at that point, and I'm sure that's still the case. So it was a great place to really catch the bug for coaching at a serious level. Yeah,
no, I can imagine being around, I suppose, such a high-performance environment, rather than perhaps, no disrespect to other universities, but if you go and play football for the first team at, for instance, the university I went to, which was Sussex, you're not going to be in the same environment, high-performance environment, as Loughborough, because of its competitive nature. And being in that environment, I guess, for sport professionals particularly, is so valuable, because rather than perhaps having your traditional picture of a university experience, which is going out drinking every night and sleeping in and going to lectures in the afternoon, it is very much more sport driven, similar to the American model, I suppose. Did you find that, and is that sort of maybe what led your decision into Loughborough?
I think so. I think what's great about Loughborough, you have a really strong sense of being part of something really big, sporting wise, and I think that that can be really inspirational. Don't get me wrong, we certainly weren't on the same level as some of the world class athletes that train there in terms of commitment, dedication, level of performance. But I think the blend of being able to be at the cutting edge of academia in sports science, performance analysis, sports coaching, being able to train in world-class facilities, making sure that performance focus still exists for players that have maybe taken their eye off the professional game, or have one eye on the professional game, one eye on a career out of the professional game. I think the blend is phenomenal, and for me it was the perfect mix of experiences to stand me in really good stead to go and pursue a proper career in coaching.
Yeah, no, that's really interesting. And then from Loughborough, you obviously went, was it to Swansea initially from there? Yeah. How did that come about? I mean, how did I suppose you get effectively recruited? Did you, is it the typical send in your CV or send out your CV to lots of academies and see what sticks? Or was that somewhere where you sort of targeted and thought, actually, I am Welsh, Swansea makes sense. How did it work?
Yeah, well, I'm a Welshman. I did my courses through the FAW, and I'd been in contact with the academy manager there at the time prior to leaving university, and I was really fortunate to have the opportunity to leave university in May or early June, and come the beginning of July be in a full-time role at Swansea City at a time where the academy was pushing towards making this step from Category 2 to Category 1. That happened eventually. It was a really exciting time for the first team, with them being in the Premier League. They went on to hit some real heights in Europa League. I was fortunate to work with some really good people there, progress relatively quickly, work with some players that have now gone on to play for some really big clubs in the Premier League, and many of whom are playing for the Wales's first team, featuring really heavily in their really successful campaigns recently. So again, following on from Loughborough, it was almost a perfect opportunity to go and immerse myself in working at a very aspirational academy, I suppose, that were doing some really good things.
Any notable players from perhaps last night's display that you work with at all, or?
Yeah, I mean, they had when you look back at the players that have been produced at Swansea over the course of the past 5, 6, 7 years, it's remarkable, really. Dan James was there, who's since been sold to Man United. Joe Roden, who's since been sold to Tottenham. Connor Roberts playing regularly for the first team and featuring for the national team very regularly. Ollie McBurney got sold from Swansea to Sheffield United. He came in and worked with the 23s whilst I was there initially. Ben Cabango is working or is playing in the first team and has also made his national team debut. So that's 5 or 6, top level Premier League, top of the Championship players to be produced from one era there. So I think it's a credit to everyone who was at the club at that point. And there continues to be some really good players in that setup.
Does that give you, does that please you, or how much do you see sort of, I know obviously there are lots of people who have lots of influences on players like Ollie McBurney, as you mentioned, Dan James. I'm not saying that you had completely a direct impact on a big money move to Man United, but does that give you a lot of pleasure when you see players that you've coached like that kind of push on and make it in a meaningful way?
Yeah, it does. And I would echo that, in the sense it's very difficult to attribute any of the players' success to any one person. I think it was a set of circumstances at Swansea whereby things fell into place really nicely. There was and continues to be some really good people that were working there. It was a point where they were really trying to push the envelope in terms of getting from Cat 2 to Cat 1. The environment was great, new training ground. So there were a load of good things, in addition to some really, really good support staff from the perspective of sports science and performance analysis that were there at that point, that could give players that holistic development package that people talk about all the time at academy level. So I think it's great from the perspective of a youth coach to be able to see players that you've worked with progress, go and live their dreams, play at the top level. And I think also in hindsight, it's a really useful thing to be able to draw upon in terms of recognizing the stages at which young players are at, what they need to do to get from A to B, B being playing at the top level. So I think the more you have that experience, then the more capable you are of recognizing, the pieces of the jigsaw that need to be put together for a young player, I suppose. So I think the more distance there is between my time there and where I am now, I think the more I appreciate that.
Yeah. No, that sounds like sort of you do have a complete understanding that I suppose the players that you've nurtured and developed are not perhaps the most. It's not all down to you, I suppose, and it is massively a team effort.
Oh, absolutely, and they worked with a number of coaches whilst they were there, and not least they've gone on to work with top coaches at their respective clubs. So I think it's you play a small part in a player's journey, but you do take satisfaction from playing that small part, I suppose.
Yeah, the age group that you were working with, was that under 18s or 23s or?
I worked with both over the course of 3.5 years there. So 18s, 20. It was the 21s back then, and then the 18s again. So I had a really good blend of experiences whilst I was there.
I think what is so interesting about you compared to perhaps coaches a similar age to you is your desire and actual maybe ability to work with those older age groups. Because a lot of coaches, maybe your age, start looking at 13s, 14s, pre-academy, academy, but you really just took the plunge, I suppose, into 18s, 23s. Obviously, first team at Shrewsbury for a little while, and now Chelsea's on the 23s. Was that just a natural desire of yours to work with the older age groups and to make an impact there, or was that just you fell into the right place?
I suppose I'd never been daunted by the prospect of working with people that were a similar age to me. It wasn't something that ever crossed my mind. I do think that if players feel as though that you can help them in some way and you can add value to their development, then and you carry yourself in the right way, I don't think you're going to have a problem. I think probably the most daunting period in that sense for me was the first step at Loughborough, where I'd gone from playing with some of the players the year before to the following year working as their coach at a point where I was still very young. So I think if ever there was a point where I was conscious of that, it was then. And in that team were some of my closest friends and friends that continue to be my closest now. So that was probably the most difficult period in that sense. Beyond that, I'd never really given it too much thought. I felt that if people could see me as someone who had the capability to develop them or help develop them, then I wouldn't have a problem. And I was quite fortunate at Swansea that very quickly, I think I was 22 when I started working with the under 21s there. I had quite a good setup around me, good people to work with. So it wasn't anything that really got in the way, I wouldn't say.
And then from there, from the 21s there, you went to, is it a club that you support still, Shrewsbury Town?
Yeah, sure. So whilst I'm a Welshman, I grew up right on the border of Shropshire and Powys. So my local professional club would be Shrewsbury. So it was a club that both me and my brother were involved with as kids. So the opportunity arose to go there initially as head of coaching. So look after an entire methodology, something I hadn't looked after previously, as well as coach the under 18s there. Moved back to Shrewsbury. And it was an opportunity that I felt was a good one at that point. It was one that would allow me to combine both coaching at a relatively high level with the under 18s, but also an element of coach education, something that I've done throughout most of my career and continue to do so. So I thought it was again a good blend, a chance to look after an entire program, and I definitely took a lot from that initial period at Shrewsbury prior to taking the role as academy manager. Sort of 6 or 7 months later.
I mean, that's where sort of you first encountered VO and the product whilst you were at Shrewsbury. Is there a massive difference in terms of budgets when you're looking at, technology, developing the club? When you're at somewhere like Swansea, knocking on the door of the Premier League, I suppose when you were at the time, or even in the Premier League when you were there to Shrewsbury. Again, I'm not saying it was a step back in your career, but it meant that you probably had to be a lot more hands-on than you were at Swansea. You had a lot more of an influence. And you had to make decisions on the different investments that you made, etc., etc. Did you enjoy that part of thing, or did you enjoy that part of it, or were you like, just getting back on the grass and let me do some coaching?
No. I think when you're young, as I was then, you've got a lot of energy, haven't you? And I think the opportunity to run an entire program, I suppose the phrase is probably be a bigger fish in a relatively small pond. You're making an awful lot of decisions. You're working with the chief exec and the chairman. You're working at board level, but also you're still coaching because it's a small club. So you're all things to all people. And I think that's where the video camera came in really, really good use for us there, because at small clubs with smaller budgets, it's all about doing more with less. So I think the use of the camera, for example, it allowed us to film far more games than we would have done without it, using only the one analyst that we had at our disposal there. So I think that was a period where I was required to do things like that, adopt strategies like that were going to allow us as a relatively small academy to run as close to a Cat 1 program as possible. So again, it was a phenomenal experience for me, because you were right in at the deep end in all senses, but crucially still coaching, still working with players across multiple age groups most days.
Yeah, I think some people sort of suggest that coaching and you want to get to the top straight away very quickly, and want to say coach at a first team level for a championship or Premier League club. Maybe for yourself, something like Shrewsbury was a great fit because it was your hometown club, and you're probably getting phone calls on a Friday night before game day from your friends asking you what you're going to do tomorrow, etc. Did you enjoy that sort of period where you're in touch with the first team and working with the first team? Was that something that really piqued your interest and sort of made you push on at into Chelsea? Sorry.
I think so. I mean, again, that's whether you see it as a plus or not is a personal opinion, but it's something that comes far more quickly at a smaller club than it does at a bigger club. So I had the opportunity with a guy called Danny Coyne, who was working as the first team goalkeeper coach, to take over on an interim basis for 7 games a couple of years ago, which was it was an unbelievable experience. It was as intense an experience as I've had in my life. The first team were in the relegation zone at that point, if not just above, and there was a real consequence around 3 points. We had 2 ties in the FA Cup, a number of league games, and it was the first time in my career where the 3 points were really, really consequential. There was money on the line and TV games on the line in the context of the FA Cup run. So it was an experience at first team level that I'd always wanted, I'd always anticipated having maybe at some point, certainly not that early in my career, but fortunately we were successful over the course of those 6 or 7 games. And I then continued at Shrewsbury working with the first team up until I left for Chelsea, I think a season or so later. But yeah, I look back incredibly favourably on that experience, and also that was, I suppose there was a bit of gloss on that in the sense that it was my hometown club. I know loads of people connected with the club. Lots of my pals from when I was younger, they go to the games, still go to the games, have always gone to the games. So it was nice to have that real connection to the people that were in the stadium too.
So how was it when you're moving out of a club that you're emotionally connected to in a way, and then going to Chelsea, and then moving? I mean, as you said, those 7 games, you got 3 points on the line and lots of money riding it, and then going into an environment where there's a different pressure, I suppose, at Chelsea to maybe anywhere else in the world because of how competitive the academy and the 23s are. What I suppose my question is, what's more pressure, coaching the other 23s at Chelsea or that 7-game period you had with Shrewsbury?
I think as you've touched upon, the pressures are very different. I think there was a real intensity to that period, but there's a real intensity at Chelsea as well. They're an academy that have a mission statement around being the best academy in the world. I think in terms of player production, success on the European scene at under 19 level, I think there's lots of objective measures that says they're very close to being that. So I think working in that environment, that in itself brings lots of pressure. Maybe not so scrutinized publicly, but you certainly feel it. You're working with players that are currently elite or potentially elite, potentially world class in some cases. So I suppose you put pressure on yourself to try and help squeeze the most out of those players and play a very small part on their journey. You're conscious of the fact that in years gone by, many top players have come through on Chelsea's production line, and you want to help contribute to that. So I think that, in addition to the fact that there's lots of internal scrutiny, I suppose, at Chelsea, there's lots of eyes on the sessions. There's lots of club legends that are still employed, that are still around the sessions. And I'm sure there's an expectation that there are going to be players that move through in the years to come. So it's nice. It's a really nice thing to be a part of, and it's a nice pressure to have, and both are nice pressures to have.
Yeah, I'm sure. I mean, it's such a interesting array of experiences that probably have taught you quite a lot in a very short space of time. For obviously the coaches who are watching / listening to this, do you have sort of a advice for them in terms of how they can get moves like the ones that you have? Because I mean, I think that you have probably been fortunate in moving Swansea to Shrewsbury to Chelsea. Not many people get that chance. How did you do it, and perhaps how can someone in your position replicate that kind of career trajectory?
It's a really difficult one. I don't necessarily think there's a formula. I suppose that the only thing you could give to someone as a piece of advice, I suppose, is to try and be as ready as possible when opportunities do arise. There's always an element of fortune in football, I think, as to who you meet at what particular point, what conversations you have, whether luck is in your favour at any one particular point. But undoubtedly, you can put yourself in a really good position if you've got as many tools under your belt as possible to take opportunities when they arise. So I think there's definitely been elements of fortune in the opportunities I've had, but I would also like to think that I've worked hard enough to make sure that when they arise, such as the one at Shrewsbury, such as the one at Chelsea, you're well equipped to give the best of yourself when they do.
Yeah, and what are those tools, do you think, that you've developed over the past sort of 6-7 years that allow you to put yourself in those types of positions? What are sort of your key elements as a coach?
I suppose that there's all the basis of your success as a coach is always going to be an understanding of the game. I think that is absolutely fundamental. So do have a detailed understanding of the game, the strategies, the tactics, the ways in which you can improve players. Do have a real depth of knowledge in terms of training methodology, the way in which you can apply that knowledge in the context of your work on the grass with players. I think those things are always going to be fundamental. But then I also think there's that set of wraparounds, interpersonal skills that are probably going to make the difference as to what level you reach. So how good a communicator are you? Interpersonal skills in terms of being able to connect with players and build relationships. I'm not saying you need to be the biggest extrovert in the room, the most charismatic person in the room, but certainly you do need to be able to strike a chord with players, and that can come from being, really jovial, a really likable bloke. It can come from being able to present information really clearly. It can take various forms, but I think the interpersonal skills that complement the on-pitch work, that's crucial. And then I suppose also that that ability to, it's almost like that contextual intelligence. Are you able to adapt to the environment that you find yourself in? One club's going to be very different to another club. So are you able to operate within that club successfully? Are you able to complement the skills of the staff that you work with? Are you able to deal with the politics of an environment, for example? I think there's a lot of stuff that also bubbles under the surface that you wouldn't necessarily be able to describe explicitly, but being able to operate in certain football club environments, I think that's something that, yes, it complements the interpersonal skills and the on-pitch skills really well.
Yeah, I think touched on it a little bit there, in the fact that you have to be very much maybe a generalist in a way, and not too specific in, being very analysis focused or very arm around the shoulder focused. You have to be able to be a bit of a chameleon in the situations that you find yourselves in as a coach, which I suppose maybe a certain, or may carry a trend in today's world. You've only got to look at coaches, Eddie Howe, yourself, Jose Mourinho, Jurgen Klopp. None of these coaches were ever incredible players and have become coaches. Do you think that's because they see the game in a more general sense rather than being super focused on their ability, and they've sort of weren't the best players, so therefore learned to read the game better? I mean, why do you think that is, that perhaps some of the best coaches coming out now haven't potentially played the game to a very high standard?
Yeah. Not sure I'd mention myself in the same breath as Klopp, Eddie Howe and Mourinho, but maybe one day. I think there's probably better examples in people like Thomas Tuchel, Julian Nagelsmann, Jose Mourinho's assistant, a guy who worked at the FAW, João Sacramento, guys who had zero playing careers. I think, and that it's an emerging trend in the game, undoubtedly, that there's a new breed, or certainly a different breed of coaches with no playing ground whatsoever, that are able to cut their teeth at the highest level. And I suppose the one thing I would say on that subject is that there's absolutely zero examples of coaches with no playing backgrounds who are also poor coaches. I think it's safe to say that if you have no playing background, you have to bring something to the table. You have to have a certain skill set. So I think the things that I mentioned earlier, the capacity to work on the pitch, being a technician, I suppose, as well as the soft skills, as well as the understanding of how to operate in an environment, I think they're all things that will set those guys apart. I think you've got a certain edge, I suppose, if you spend your 20s and early 30s learning to coach, learning to communicate, learning to be on the grass, developing a real intuition and a sense for what good coaching is, how to work with players. I think most ex-players will tell you that they're not necessarily experiences that they've had. They couldn't have done because they've spent 15 years learning the game in another way. I'm not saying one's better than the other, but I think it's a surefire thing that if you're a non-ex-player, you have to bring a real skill set to the table. There's no way you're getting in the door if that's not the case.
Yeah, no, I can definitely imagine that. I'm not saying that former players have an extra foot in the door, but I imagine that it's a lot harder for someone like yourself who didn't necessarily play at the highest level compared to someone who has played at the highest level to begin a coaching career. I
don't think there's certainly no one way. There's certainly no one emerging profile that's more successful than the other, because in the same vein as you've got people like Nagelsmann and Tuchel and various others appearing, you've also got Frank Lampard, Steven Gerrard, phenomenal ex-players that are also showing themselves to be really, really capable top-level coaches. So I think there's no one profile that guarantees someone's success. I think it's a combination of things. Everyone's journey is different, but I do think that the one rule you can stand by is that as a non-ex player, you've got to be a good coach.
Yeah, no, for sure. I think the idea from sort of this webinar particularly was to address some of the coaching methodologies that you've developed over the last 6 years, with perhaps technology in mind. First question on that is, how has technology impacted you as a coach, during these last, because there has been a bit of a sports technology revolution, I would say, in the last 6 or 7 years with GPS vests, obviously AI cameras, all sorts of things that have come out. I've seen now, glucose tracking devices that people are wearing. How has it impacted you, from being a young coach coming through to probably being very football focused, now having to be very analyst focused, being very aware of sports science and all of that, everything that comes with being a professional coach?
Yeah, I think undoubtedly you've got to be very open-minded when it comes to technology, even if technology isn't necessarily your forte. I think you've got to be open-minded enough to develop certainly the ability to engage in conversation with the various experts that surround you at a professional club level. I think from my personal perspective, if I look back to the work that I would have done at Swansea initially to the work that I would do now, technology has really facilitated the way I work now, in the sense that it's far easier to communicate your message if you're very sharp from the perspective of dealing with analysis technology, dealing with presentation technology. Then I think you stand yourself in really good stead as a modern day coach, I would say. I think that there's an expectation now with young players, among young players that are emerging from Category 1 academies, that technology is used to communicate with them. It's used to discuss game plans, be clear in terms of strategy, develop them as individual players, engage them in the process of their own development. So certainly from an analysis perspective, that's, it's there all the time in my life as a coach. Not a day goes by without me using a piece of software. From a sports science perspective, you talked about GPS tracking and other ways of monitoring players. Not necessarily my forte, but certainly something I'm willing to engage in. I'm by no means an expert, but I certainly like to think that I could have a really purposeful conversation with a sports scientist about how our weeks look from a data point of view, what it might need to look like next week, what the metrics mean, what benchmarks we might put in place for a coming period of training. So I think it's about making sure that if you've got weaknesses from the perspective of technological understanding, you brush them up, but also embrace the elements that are going to give you a real strength as a coach, like analysis tools. Yeah,
I mean, there's so much data, event, video, psychological tools now that the top level clubs are using. Do you sort of, in a way, feel it hinders you sometimes, or hinders coaches sometimes, to have so much information, constantly being pushed in their faces about this player and that player, that actually you just want to watch them play and decide for yourself whether or not you're going to start on the Saturday?
I think there's really few angles that you can consider that from. The first is that I don't think it's, certainly at the top level, it's not going to change. It's not going to go away. It's only going to become more embedded within the game, in the sense that so much money is pumped into the game at the top level that owners and chief executives aren't going to want to leave any stone unturned. So I think you see at the top clubs the way in which they use data to make sure that no corners cut, that it's gold standard. I think from a coach on the grounds perspective, you would never want to lose your intuition, your your sense of what's good, what's not good. But I think as is talked about regularly on this type of thing, around this type of subject, data and analysis is a really good way to back up objectively, or deny objectively, I suppose, what might be someone's subjective opinion. So I think I would always use it in that way. I think you mentioned that it can hinder. I do think that there's potentially an issue in academies at this point or it's something that's talked about regularly. I think that young players can be prematurely professional, I suppose, in the sense that there is a phenomenal program of analysis and data wrapped around players very young. No examples specifically, but I think that's something that's talked about regularly in the coaching community. So I think it maybe can hinder in that sense, but I think at the top level, it's definitely something that if used well, it complements what would be your intuition and your sense.
Yeah, I mean, if you were, say, picking a team on a Saturday, which I suppose you often do, and have that process in mind, do you go back and watch previous games, video from previous games, or do you look at the GPS data from previous games, or do you sort of focus on how they've done in training this week? What, say, is the priority 1, 2, 3 that you think actually, didn't play so well last game, let's give him a rest, let's get his head together? Or is it more sort of you look really good in training this week, let's give him a start even though he played not so well last game? Is there a priority that you go by, or like a playbook that you go by?
I suppose it depends hugely on what level you're working at. I think the way in which you make decisions as a coach working at under 23 level versus a coach working at first team level differs hugely, in the sense that sometimes at under 23 level the picture is far bigger than the immediate Saturday. Whereas at first team level, I think you make much more pragmatic decisions based upon an upcoming opposition. So perhaps, if we start there with decisions at first team level, I think you analyse the opposition based on video footage. There might be some statistical work that has confirmed or given you a much clearer picture as to how an opposition play. There'll have been a period of analysing your own team's performance, your team's training performances, and then I think you try and pick the pieces of the jigsaw that fit best in terms of winning this upcoming game. I think at under 23 level, the picture's different in the sense that sometimes the opposition doesn't come into it all too often. Sometimes there's a far bigger picture around an individual player, their involvement in other parts of the program, for example, what their long-term development plan looks like. So I think it's a thing with a lot of moving parts depending on the level you're at. But certainly the higher the level, the more the analysis is crucial in terms of that immediate result on the Saturday.
Yeah, I think I just wanted to pick up on the point that you made about subjective opinion and data backing up subjective opinion. I think that's really important to note, because you can obviously tell on the face of it how good a player is by the way they perform against perhaps the opposite number. And if they don't perform so well, their stats or running stats could be absolutely incredible and they could look very fit, but they haven't had a touch of a ball. I think it's really important to, keep the magic alive, if you like, and keep, I expect Zinedine Zidane wouldn't have had the most amazing running stats, nor Dimitar Berbatov, but both incredible players, and that is, not just a subjective, but definitely an objective opinion in those two cases. So I think it is really important to note that data analysis, although a very good tool, certainly should never be used as the be all and end all, and this idea of Moneyball that many obviously American sports have adopted, perhaps hopefully anyway, won't apply too much in football in the near future. Would you agree with that, and would you hope for that?
Yeah, I think so. It's another layer of thinking. It's another layer of analysing your own team and analysing the opposition team from the perspective of GPS statistics and other statistics that you might be able to gather. No question. I think as a coach, you want a real sense. You want your intuition really to guide you. And if you feel like there is some ambiguity, something that doesn't quite feel right, then you've got a layer of data that you can refer to. So I think, again, as a coach operating in the modern day where these data sources are they're so ready at most levels, I think you've got to have the capacity to engage with the people that can provide you with those. Otherwise you're potentially missing a trick. You're not definitely missing a trick, but I'm sure there'll be certain points in the season where points of data become really, really important.
Interesting. Okay. So finally, really, just if you can, Eric, what is the maybe one or two things that you would say to developing coaches, perhaps not even, coaches who are looking to break through a professional. So a lot of our coaches at VO, a lot of our customers are people who just love coaching.
Yeah.
What would you say to them that they can improve? One piece of advice maybe that they can improve their day-to-day, that is a bit of a secret that professionals use in the modern day, improve their day-to-day coaching, and how can they do that?
Well, this is where the VO camera may come in handy, because I think over the course of my time, watching yourself coach it's an invaluable tool. If you've got a real desire to improve as a coach, then that the self-awareness that watching yourself coach can breed is really important. So it's something that I've done really regularly over the course of the last 5 or 6 years. And you can certainly, if your guys are listening to this and they've got their camera then recording the audio in their pocket with their iPhone and syncing it to the footage that they get from you guys, then that's a really useful tool in breeding that self-awareness, working out where you might be weaker than you thought or stronger than you thought, because we're definitely not as self-aware as we think we are. So I think, again, that layer of self-analysis is really important.
Okay, brilliant. Well, yeah, thanks so much, Eric. It's been insightful. Really interested to find out more about you as well as a young coach, and obviously best of luck for the rest of the year at Chelsea, and obviously best of luck in the rest of your career as well. I'm sure you'll go on to do really good things.
Thank you very much.